Hello.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. Thank
Hello.
you. Thank you for being available. Thank you for being available today
Pleasure.
for short time and just being conversation. I appreciate it. For everyone watching, welcome to the 56th Chicago International Film Festival Coffee Talks. My name is Joy Norris. I am Black Perspectives and After Dark programmer this festival season. And today we're in conversation around dreams from the diaspora. And joining us today are filmmakers Ekwa Msangi, Felwer Amour, Katarama Gahikiri, Ethereality, and Taboho Maliboho with Heaven Reaches Down to Earth. Again, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Of course. So the theme today, Dreams within the Diaspora, is twofold. One, all of your films have this very lush, dreamy quality to it. And I'm curious to know about how you formed your vision as filmmakers from the diaspora, as diasporic filmmakers. But also, it was inspired by something that Katarama said at an earlier Q&A about the dream of wanting to build more film programs, particularly in Rwanda, where her family, part of her family is from, and sort of curious about the desire to build more of film programs across, if you have this dream of building more film programs across the continent or in the respective countries of your family's origins, and what that could mean for, African cinema. So if Ekwa, you might want to chime in first.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here among such wonderful company. My family's from Tanzania. I grew up in Kenya, which is where I'm joining from now. And I don't know if I've ever thought, I went to film school. I went to film school in New York. And from what I've seen of film schools on the continent, some at which I have taught, they tend to, in my opinion, kind of mimic European standards of filmmaking, or which is true of, I guess, any kind of all of our education generally comes from, colonized education. And so I think my personal desire before building a film school would be to, it's almost like building a film aesthetic, or reimagining how stories are told, because I think as people of African heritage, that includes people in the Caribbean, people on the American continent, etc., we have very specific ways of expressing ourselves, not just in film, in music, in all the arts that we partake in. We tend to set the standards, actually. And we have ways, just even in terms of how we deal with the language, how we speak, the different Englishes that we speak, the different Frenches and Spanishes and whatever that we speak. There's a way that we take all of those things and sort of like, wrestle it around and make it our own. And I would like us to do that with film more. We just haven't. Film is expensive, so we haven't had as much time to like really get our fingers into it, I think. But there's things coming out from the continent that you can see, like we're right there on the cusp of doing our own thing. So I would be more interested in seeing us grow that aspect, like growing our own voice and our own expression, as opposed to just kind of taking what everybody else has been doing for the past century and like redoing that because that's the standard, but creating our own standard.
Thank you. Taboho, would you like to?
For sure. I think that I agree with everything Kwa said, and it's really funny because I did my first film degree in Africa, and now I'm doing my post grad film degree here in the U.S. And I think that it's really funny that one of the things people want is for you to bring influence from the continent. But as Ekwa said, many of the things that I was taught, which is how to make films that had a very Western, USA focused aesthetic, but then also the way that we would end up marketing them and the way that we would end up even projecting films as well. So I think it's about the in between, right? It's about finding a conversation and using the actual culture that isn't often depicted, and to find our own stories using the medium as opposed to using the medium to tell stories that we've already seen. With many of my fellow filmmakers, there's this disconnect of like some of the time not seeing the interest in our own lives and not really thinking that anything that we live day to day is really worth, you know, putting onto a screen in the same regard and with the same respect that we see many films from some of the other continents. So I think trying to depict things, trying to depict things that may seem mundane for us, but are actually larger than life and create a very particular form of what it is to be African is really important to me. So I think, again, it's an ongoing discussion. I don't know what the end looks like, but I think that we're getting closer to it.
Councilor, please.
Sure. Thank you for having me today, and it's very an honor to be in such great company. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying, both Ekwa and Tibogo, that it's a matter of focusing on the content and what is our voice and what can we bring to the world. I think that our stories are already there, and they have been there for so long. It's just a matter of the other world to discover them, right? Because we've been telling our stories since I can't even remember, but since my ancestors' times, right? For instance, in Rwanda, there's a really long tradition of poetry, and there had been schools where you would train for 10 or 20 years before you could perform in front of the king. So the stories are still here. And I know quite a few filmmakers that are telling those stories. For me, when I was talking about teaching, it probably would be also more towards technique and this kind of aspect, because I think that we ought to find our own voices. And as Haile Gerima put it very well, he said that we need to decolonize our minds, because a story doesn't necessarily mean something built in 3 acts. We have our own way, our own flow, our own codes, our own mythology. So it's really about owning this and being proud and digging into our culture to create those stories and those films. Because, and this is my take, but when I watch at films that Hollywood is making nowadays, I find almost no surprise. I mean, I've seen a lot of those films and they repeat them again and again and again. And what is interesting to me is what I can find in other places on the continent or even Latin America or Asia. They all have like very interesting storytelling at the moment. So maybe also what would be a way is to link all those different parts of the world so we can learn from each other and see and compare and challenged and to grow together. But ultimately it's about finding our own voice. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I also, just to add to that, I think, you know, as everybody here has said, like we are actually doing that. Then we've been doing that, so it's not new. I think what's new is just the technology. You know, for a long time with our film ancestors, you know, they were working on film. It's really expensive. They had to send the film to Europe to get processed and edited, and they didn't have say over the final cut, all these different things. And now we're in digital and cameras are getting much smaller, and people are working on their phones and doing all these different things. And I think it's in way, there's if you go to enough film festivals, there's African aesthetics that have been put out where it's like a wilderness or a savanna, or, everybody's got babies on their backs, or that's like an African story, or it's like tragic and like women are wailing everywhere, like that's an African story. And not to say that it's not. I think that it's a matter, for me at least, it's a matter of expanding what is an African story, or a way of telling an African story. I think you're seeing certain things even through music videos. Beyonce just had her whole, epic, her whole epic, a few months ago of that was very African in its sense too. And then you're seeing a lot of copies where it's like, it's not African if we're not all wearing leopard print. And it's like, okay, that's one way of interpreting things too. Not to say that that's not right, but just, I feel very sensitive about us getting caught in just like one bucket where like, this is the only way to do it. These are the only stories. These are the only ways to tell our stories. If you want to like belong to this sector, I think it doesn't even have to be about form. It could be about, like I said, even just the way we use language or how we use music or how we structure it. We tell it front to back or back to front or, whatever, different things in the same ways that, African artists have been doing forever with music and blues and jazz and Afrobeat and all of the things that we've created and put out into the world and become world leaders at. I completely do expect that we will do the same as African heritage people in general, in film. It's just a matter of finding the money to do that.
Yeah.
That was a question I had of what are your thoughts on the term African aesthetic? And Ekwa, you've definitely laid it out pretty nicely there. I'm curious if you feel like even its existence has, if there's a benefit to it, because it's still being parsed out. It does. It's the same, I think, in terms of like how Black Americans view, Black film, or being called a Black filmmaker and being expected to make a certain kind of film. And if you're not, then is it Black? And how does that, kind of make you beholden to certain stories?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see, is there a similarity in that, or is there a criticism and like, oh, this isn't African because you're not doing that? If Taboho and Katarama, if you run up against those issues.
Go ahead.
Well, there's two things here that I'd like to say. First of all, is the term African cinema, that is this huge bag where we put so many countries in. And I don't know, I'm working in Rwanda, in Kenya, in Uganda, and sometimes I'm going to a festival in Burkina Faso or in Senegal or in Tunisia or in South Africa, and the situation couldn't be more different. And the sensitivity and the stories, and the distance, by the way, it's a huge continent. So I don't know if I like the term African cinema. I wouldn't speak about European cinema, for instance. So why should I speak about African cinema? I want to be more specific. And as of a matter of like being in Europe and coming and making films in Africa, well, of course there is a different gaze. It's my point of view, and I have to own that. And I think as long as I'm comfortable and I'm true to what stories I'd like to tell, and I'm trying to respect also what I'm doing on the ground, who I'm meeting, and be truthful to that, it's okay to move around, but it's so much easier to come from Europe and go film something in Africa than the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also like some sort of problem, because you expect African cinema to be stuck in Africa. And why are I don't know, French filmmakers able to go film something in Senegal and call it French cinema or mixed or yeah.
For sure. I think that the other two filmmakers put it very well. But just to add, um, I think it's about what kind of ownership and who has the ownership over the actual term. Because I think that, you know, Black people, African people, we always have a very cultural ownership over things, but not a proprietary ownership of who is actually getting to tell these different stories, who is getting funded, who is getting seen, who is getting screened. As you just said, Kantarama, it seems like with some filmmakers, they're able to go to different places and they're able to take whatever culture they had with them and they're able to go and depict it somewhere else. And no one will say that it's now a, you know, Ugandan film. It's still French or wherever the other filmmakers may have come from. And I think until we as you know, African filmmakers get to take that same ownership over the work that we get to tell, and as we were saying as well, get to actually decide what makes up all of these different countries and the specific filmic language they will use, as opposed to employing them all into one big idea of what it is to be African. I think that much of the beauty is to be found in the individual voices and the individual struggles and the individual glories we face as we're trying to create films on the continent.
Yeah, it's tricky. You know, African cinema and the African cinema space literally has kept me alive as a filmmaker, has kept me alive as a filmmaker in the very literal sense. I was at a point at the end of my, you know, fourth year in film school where I was sure I could not make films because I just could not get anyone to understand what I was trying to do. And it wasn't until I discovered at that point that there was African cinema and there were all these filmmakers that have been making films for decades that I'd never heard of, that I understood the problem wasn't my film. The problem was that I was talking to the wrong audience. And so I just shifted my audience and have been telling films for my people for a really long time. And those are the people who sustain me, where it's like, we're actually having a conversation and we're going back and forth. And so I'm very protective, and you know, I feel very dear about African cinema and like preserving that, because it's something that I feel very proud of calling myself and identifying as an African filmmaker. And I feel like all the films that I will make will be African films because I'm African, and that's my point of view. Even if I'm telling somebody else's story, the way in which I use the tools, I draw that from my culture. A lot of that I draw from my culture. And I'm also not at a point where I feel the need to tell stories about other people's cultures. And by other people, I mean non-Black people. Because I feel like we've had a long time watching other people's culture. I've certainly grown up watching everybody else's culture except mine. So I feel very protective about that. But I do know that, you know, there is a very political way in which that is used, that terminology is used. You know, when I'm from East Africa, there have been films that have been shot here, big Hollywood films for decades, you know, Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, and Constant Gardener, and whatever. And those are never called African films. You know, that's not African cinema, even though everybody in it is African. Well, for a lot of them. Some of, you know, like the content, the context, the locations, the whatever is African, but they're considered European films because, well, in a lot of those cases, it's about Europeans finding themselves in Africa. Different conversation. But I do think, I don't know, I just, again, similar to like your previous question, I feel like there, you know, our work as artists is to expand the boundaries. You know, for the longest time, the definition of African film is like films about Africans in Africa, doing African things, speaking an African language, you know, within this border right here of this continent. And then everything else is like everyone else. And I feel like I feel like our borders need to spread a lot wider because our culture spreads a lot wider and our influence spreads a lot wider. So it will come. Those are my dreams.
To that, you touched on two things. I think Black filmmakers have to always consider in some regard is audience and a sense of duty in telling certain stories. I wonder how you all contend with those two mindsets or elements of creating. I know, I guess, considering an intended audience can be a really like soul sucking endeavor because, you don't want to make something that's so broad or so wide ranging that no one is, attracted to what you're making. It doesn't really resonate with anyone because it's supposed to resonate with everyone. But how do those two things play into, your creative process? Whoever would like to go. I hate to be like a teacher, like, Taboho, speak. But whoever feels, need to talk on that.
Go ahead, Kantarama. You look like you're ready.
Do I? See, I tend to think about the story first and what I'm concerned with at this moment and what my obsessions are and why can I not stop digging into this topic, or who is this person I would like to tell the story about. Or so this is my main first concern when I start a project. I think I have to have some sort of emotional connection to it, and not only emotional connection, but obsession somehow, because it takes so much and so many hours and so much work to make it happen. So most of the time, these are the factors that jumpstart the project. And then after a while, I guess the project finds its audience, but probably because I am concerned about immigration and integration, like not on a regular basis, but it's been a few projects that the audience from the other projects are following what I'm doing, and this is how, thankfully, they're watching what I'm doing today, and they hopefully will watch what I will be doing tomorrow. So this, in terms of audience, to address your question about responsibility, duty, I think, yes, we are privileged to have a voice, and so we should use it to say things, to try to represent our ideas or the people, or to also try to change things, to try to bring awareness to some issues. Yes, we definitely have a duty in what we are doing, because also, like Ekwa, you were saying, there's not a lot of films about Black or African or diaspora or Black people. So we are fortunate to create content and to create images that can inspire. So we have a duty. Yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think my desire and mission to become a filmmaker came directly out of the lack of seeing any stories that reflected me, my people, my reality, I grew up in Kenya in the 80s and 90s where everything was American and British, and that was it. We got to see ourselves on the news and maybe like one or two slapstick comedy shows, and that was the extent of things. If you wanted to relate to someone, maybe the Cosbys, Webster, like one or two American shows that had one or two American people, like Black people in it. But that was it. Sarafina came out in the 90s, and that was like this major epic, like, oh my God, like our lives were changed because we actually saw somebody who didn't speak our language, but it was a language that was close enough. It was like, all right, I get it. I see what you're trying to do. And again, like I just mentioned before, this is a continent that's had filmmakers working for decades, and we never got to see their films because digital, because colonialism, because all the things. And so, therefore, for me, I feel like a very, I mean, a duty, yes, but also just a burning desire to, like, I feel like there's so much work to do. There's so many stories to be told. And I feel like as a continent and as an industry in general, like we have spent about a century examining every aspect of white men's lives, like all of their fears, all of their hopes, all of their dreams, their fantasies, their jokes, their like just everything, like every aspect of like the psychos, the really intelligent people, the really dumb people. Like we've seen every single thing. I feel like if we took a break for 5 years, we'd still be good. And we just spent like 5 years focusing on anybody else, we'd still have a lot of ground to cover. And I'm not saying like it needs to be one or the other. I'm just saying for me, in terms of the stories that I want to tell and the energy that I want to put into a project, because it takes, 2, 3 years to work on any single project. If I'm going to put that much time and energy into it, it doesn't make sense for me to do that for anybody else. So I mean, it's a duty, but for me, it's also like a intense joy, and a huge privilege that we get this platform. As I've mentioned many times in this chat already, it is so expensive to make films. So if you put in all the time and energy and like get a whole bunch of people to invest in your film, like it's got to mean something. And to me, that's what's most important for me and most urgent as well.
For sure. So well said from the other two. I think I had a discussion with my producer, and we were discussing how we would like to see a pivot from how the world sees us to how we see ourselves. And I think that's what I really like to do with the work. Just to speak to this particular film, it does deal with a blooming romance between two men, and we really chatted about it, me and my producer, and we said, let's not have a film that'll end with a tragedy. You don't want to further the whole notion that anything happening in Africa has to end in a tragedy, or that we bring violence upon our own people often, or that we do that for no reason. There's this interesting field that you're kind of trying to walk in, and like not to step on like any of the mines, in terms of adding fuel onto this fire that deals with so many stereotypes that have been said about Africa. So I do feel like there is a duty to, I think, to pay homage to people who didn't get the actual chance to tell their own stories, and to pay homage to the people who are still living in the continent now, who don't have the means to create film. And then realizing that film is a privilege, and it's a beautiful medium to be working in. And it does come with that burden of making sure that you have proper representation. So that's how I've been dealing with it lately.
I think that's so important what you just said, Teboho, about like, it's one thing about like educating the world about who we are and what we look like and whatever, but I think there's so much work to be done that's, in my opinion, so much more important about like educating ourselves about ourselves individually within our own little bubbles, but also like, what are Rwandese people doing? What are South African people like across the borders? Because that's also a privilege that we haven't had, is just like being able to see each other on the continent, like who we are and understanding our own histories, and diaspora as well. Because, if you think about the images of African Americans that have been put out around the world, like we see one image of African American people that is very limiting to what the breadth of the history, the culture, the everything is. And so I think the re-education in that is so important. And also within all of the tragedies and challenges and blah, blah, blah that we have, the idea of us sort of taking on this label as like the people with challenges, the people with AIDS, the people with genocide, the people with, safaris is like a very, very limited way of just kind of seeing us and seeing ourselves, but also within those things. Yes, we do have all of those things, those are true. But we're not just like rocking ourselves under the table and crying ourselves to sleep every night because we have challenges. Like we also have plenty of humor, plenty of love, plenty of laughter in the midst of our challenges. And those are things that we never discuss amongst ourselves even, but it is true in how we live. And so being able to reflect that is a huge privilege.
I mean, I think yes to everything you're saying. And I'm curious. I'm glad that Katsurama said the Haile Garima quote. How are you all actively decolonizing your minds? And any advice you want to share to the wider world, to our communities on, kind of making this a group therapy sesh?
Should I?
Yeah, go for it.
I think for me, I've been reading a lot. I've been researching. There are really important books. There are films. There are art. Like the material is there, and we are at this really fortunate time where, with internet, with digitalization, we have access to all this. So I've been really into a swirl of thirst for knowledge, and I've been reading and watching and hearing, listening to music and everything that could be helping to change my ideas and challenge them, and I found wonderful things: films, books, music. So it is there. I think the also maybe just start to discuss amongst each other, and hey, I've read this, have a look, and so build communities, and just be proud of what we are, and try to share all this beautiful culture that we have. So this is how I've been searching and trying to decolonize my mind.
You want to go to
Sure thing. I think for me, it also has to do with how I write stories now, and what I consider to be a complete story. I think that I used to have like a very Western set in stone idea of what it is. Like, that you have to have rising action here, and then it has to end with this particular thing, and that really informs much of the work that I created. But I think it's unlearning. It's realizing that you can actually do whatever you want as long as it's in line with a certain vision, and as long as you trust yourself, and as long as you, as you're saying, Kansaram, reading up about references out of what I would normally read up on, because I grew up watching many films from the West, and there's still some of my favorite films to this day. But it's just about deciding what those stories did for you, why you were first drawn to them, and then finding the same patterns back within your own home country and within your own continent, and then finding newer filmmakers, newer authors to then latch onto, and to see the way that they did things. And what's really interesting with many of those references is that many of them didn't get the chance to be turned into films. It's, you can read an author or you can read plays that were never really read that widely, or that weren't taught in any school, and that your interpretation could be one of the first as well. So it's really fascinating to me finding those pieces of work and then adapting them to my own work as well.
Yeah. I think for me, it's what everybody said for one, but I don't know. I mean, my obsession of late has been around language and the way that we use language, and the fact that language has been one of the main barriers between a lot of us in terms of just even on the continent, not being able to speak to the people in the country next door, or even within our country, because I speak this and you speak that, and the church that set up shop in your part of the country was different from the church that set up shop in mine, and therefore our influences are different, and all the things that come from that. So being able to the idea, Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about telling stories in our own languages, and what does that mean? It's one thing in writing, because writing is all words, but cinema is visual. And so, what can we do and how can we play so that I'm still able to speak to my French speaking, Portuguese speaking, Spanish speaking, whoever speaking, brethren, and get my stories across in the way that we do with music. For example, it's like we can share music on the continent and enjoy it and have like this big hit, and I have no idea what these people are saying, but I still feel something from it. And then just all the education, everything that Kantarama spoke about in terms of like reading and understanding, like kind of like where our history, where we've been, and the ways in which we've been depicted, and the limitations that have been put on us, and how previous artists were able to work around those in different ways, and trying to figure out the workaround in our particular medium that we're working with. And the fact that there's a lot of myths that have been set up and told about us, about, for example, Africans and African Americans don't get along, and we don't see eye to eye, and we don't have a similar history. And that's actually really untrue. Like, we've been fighting together for similar causes, including people from the European continent and from the Caribbean continent, etc. Like, we've actually been speaking to each other and helping each other for centuries. But that's something that hasn't really been, and so kind of re-educating myself on a lot of things, so that when I go into the rooms that I'm beginning to have access to, and the decision makers that I'm beginning to have access to, while people are in a state of rethinking racism and race relations, and whether Black lives really do matter to them or not, these are the conversations that I can be ready to have, and answers that we can be ready to give about, it's not just about like building some wells in some village and being like, okay, we're done with helping Black people and now we can keep doing what we did before. But like, we're going to have to change a lot of the ways that we have depicted people, and the kinds of stories that we've told about people, and the, insidious little things here and there that we've said, the way that we've even depicted men or women or Africans or non-Africans, etc. Like, all of those really things, like, we really have to pull all of those things apart, and just challenge it for ourselves. The amount of very sad and tragic, there's very set kind of stories that have been told, that have been allowed to be told, big budget stories that have been allowed to be told about Africans, which is usually like either the most exceptional African that ever lived, or Nelson Mandela, or the most tragic situation that ever was, and then there's like nothing in between. And so how, like, there's so much space there. There's so much more space. So trying to take up a lot of that space.
For sure.
There are already so many films about, I don't know, Westerns or thrillers or love stories, etc., that there are so many of it already. So it's just a matter of showing positive or just daily life images and telling our stories, and slowly the world will discover them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it does feel like there's more hope now, seeing what Black filmmakers across the globe are making. And it's more now that's without the explanatory comma of what it means to be Black, right? And I'm grateful. I can't wait to see like even what the next 5 years is going to look like in Black film, in storytelling, because television now, the web series, all of these things are beginning to get attention and are really, if not to anybody outside of the community, but at least within the community, people are now recognizing like, oh, I do have the power to do this, and people will listen, So I think it's exciting with all the things that come with it, of course.
Right.
But as we're winding down, I'm curious, are there any questions that you all have for one another, or anything you would like to just say or express?
I'd love to know what your films are about.
Right. Tabo, you spoke some, well, I guess you both have spoken on some of what your films are, but would you like to give us sort of what sparked the ideas behind your films?
Oh yeah, for sure. So it's about two guys who are on a trip and they realize they have feelings for each other. But basically, we wanted to make 10 minutes worth of that moment that you realize that you love someone. What would that look like if you slowed it down for that long? And what does it look like, again, in a South African context, against some of the rampant homophobia that we have? What does it look like if we remove these two characters from that? Like, if we don't make this another queer tragic story, but if we'd rather just explore them kind of exploring each other. And I think that it just came from my producer and I having conversations about not feeling like there's enough representation of that.
Mm-hmm.
The film Eta Reality came from a program I was in, which invited 5 filmmakers, one from Sudan, one from Burkina Faso, one from South Africa, one from Algeria, and I was representing Rwanda. And we were all in this little town for 5 weeks trying to make a film. And so I was trying to find a subject, and finally found myself going back and again in the same shop, which is Osina shop, held by this lovely Nigerian man. And a lot of African community from this town was going there. And I realized, well, this is the film. I need to make a film about these people. And as I was talking and as they were really kind to share their stories with me, I tried to find a way to tell the story. And this is when the idea of the astronaut coming back to Earth came, and I was able to weave those two stories together, because the astronaut has the same feeling coming back and not knowing really how to reconnect with a place where he or she hasn't been in so many years, and being invisible in the middle of the city, yet not being able to remove this costume. So I thought this would tell the story well. And I'm really grateful for the people who opened up so quickly and shared really beautiful stories. So yeah, this is the reality.
That's good. So it's set in Nigeria?
It's set in Switzerland with Nigerian mostly, but there's also other nationalities. And it's really about what it is that you're missing from home, or what does home mean to you. Yeah.
And Teboho, yours is set in?
Mine is in South Africa.
Set in South Africa. Okay, cool. Okay, my story is it's called Farewell Amor. It's set in Brooklyn, and it is a story about a family that's been separated for 17 years due to visa issues. And at the beginning of the story, they're finally reunited, and the journey that we go on with them is of them rediscovering each other and themselves, and the relationship as husband, wife, father, daughter, etc. And it was inspired by real life circumstances with an aunt and uncle of mine who were married in the mid 90s. And my uncle got a student visa and went to the States and had every intention of bringing my aunt and cousin right behind him, and have been caught in endless visa applications. And, until today, there's still, uncle hasn't gone back and auntie hasn't come this way. And so, over the years, watching how this has changed their lives and changed them, their persons, and the kinds of people that they've had to turn into in order to stay hopeful that one day this will happen, was interesting as a premise to me. And so it's the imagination of, well, what would happen if the visa was no longer the issue, aunt and cousin were able to show up, where do they begin? And so it kind of starts in a way that feels like, yay, we won, problems are solved. But, as we all know, I mean, even if with a long distance relationship, if you're with a lover and you haven't seen them for a few months, let alone 17 years, the kinds of things that you have to do in terms of readjusting what you thought they were, what you thought you were, what you thought the relationship was, and what you thought it meant to you versus what it meant to me, etc., was an interesting premise for me to explore. So that's what the story's about.
Thank you all for sharing. I hope you can share your films with one another and connect, because I know you have so much more to talk about after seeing these projects. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to just speak, to speak on this and to just be in community. And I so appreciate it. I appreciate you all sharing your films with us. This year has just been exceptional for the Black Perspectives program across the festival. And it just, again, highlights the breadth of imagination and creativity and personal experience that, we all have and need to be broadcast to the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yay! I'm glad you enjoy this. All right. Take care, you all.